when we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word. What a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still, and with all.
Today's Mother's Day. You all know that. It's on the board. Our amazing mothers. In 1865, I'm not going to read the whole poem, but you'll be familiar with the line I'm going to read. In 1865, W.R. Wallace wrote a poem, "The hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world." And he wrote 4 verses of that. He ended every verse with that line. The hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world. Now, very briefly, Mother's Day, most of you already know this. Mother's Day was started by Anna Jarvis. She petitioned and campaigned to have Mother's Day recognized. And finally it was in 1914. But by 1920, she was very disgusted with Mother's Day. She said that people commercialized it. And in the obituary, when she passed away, they printed a statement she made. She said, "A printed card means nothing except that you're too lazy to write to the woman who's done more for you than anyone else in the world. And candy, you take a box to Mother and then you eat most of it yourself." So she campaigned to have Mother's Day, then eliminated even after those years working to have it installed. Now, most of that concept of Mother's Day is focused on mom at home, but we're going to focus on not mom at home, but mothers in general, old-time mothers of our past. I'm going to do a lot of reading today, okay, because what I'm going to read, there's no way I could make it sound better than what this author did. So I'm going to do a lot of reading today. In 1940, Albert Nelson wrote a book called The Pioneer Mother. Mr. Nelson was caretaker of the Lehman Cemetery from the late 1920s to the 1950s. His papers are the collection of the Minnesota Historical Society. All right, now, so I'm going to read a lot from him today. Living in a lonesome shack, poorly clothed and fed, and eternally slaving over a wood fire, children, spinning wheels, loom, and a wash tub is not the least our idea of it. But if it were not for that very real and very brave and very spirited kind of sporting blood, we would never have had a country at all. Now, I want to point out, these people lived in what is considered primitive conditions, but I want to point out they were not primitive people. They're people, for the most part, came from the East, from homes, and they came here following a dream. They were not primitive people, and they didn't live in those sod homes any longer than absolutely necessary. Then they built better structures. Anyway, he continues. The kind of sporting blood that the pioneer women of America showed at the daily risk of their lives from the time of our first settlements, and if that doesn't entitle them to a lion's share of the nation's monuments, I cannot imagine what would. It took 150 years from the time of the first settlements for the frontier to cross the Alleghenies. It took another 50 for it to cross the Mississippi. The migration westward followed the course that migrations has always followed in human history. From the Alleghenies to the Mississippi, the struggle was hard enough. From the Mississippi to the Pacific, it was a Paco. The territory was larger and wilder and more remote, the climate more severe, Indians more hostile. Now, as we talk about here, and they're referring to the settlement of the West, it's clear that they talk about settlement of the West, they're clearly talking about establishing a homeland, a nation for white people. That's what the whole intention was. And it makes it clear they talk about combating the Indians. They did not consider the Indians part of the Americas. Anyway, continuing on. He writes this, again, in 1940. He wrote this. It is not so many years since the last formidable Indian uprising was subdued. This is 1940. So you're going back like 60 years to 1890. And there was skirmishes with the Indians at that date. That's 60 years. That's younger than some of the people that are here. There are still those who remember it. What this meant to the settlers of the West for the preceding years is better imagined than described. To follow in detail the dangers and disasters of the pioneer wagon trains is to open up a chapter of horrors that repel recital. Death by starvation, thirst in storms and snowdrifts, commonplace. Bleaching bones or milestones on all the traveled routes. The description of the Indian outrages as recorded by Army observers are utterly unspeakable. Many pioneer mothers carried with them a matter of course a supply of the swiftest and deadliest of poisons for themselves and their loved ones. They fought shoulder to shoulder with the men when all hope was gone, committed suicide. You know, we don't want to judge that. Sometimes people sit today, how could they do that? And judge that? You don't want to judge the horror that they were facing when death might have been sweeter than the torment and the torture of the Indians for themselves and their children. More often, fortunately, they won, and usually against heavy odds. Plenty of pioneer mothers, single-handed, had defended their homes against roving bands of Indians. If they only came to steal the land, that alone meant tragedy on the plains. What then are we to say about the pioneer woman who with nothing made and preserved an empire for us, and who for all that were not ashamed of being a woman? They never had an inferiority complex or considered it necessary to prove themselves the equal of men. It never occurred to them that they were not, or to the men either, for the frontier in its fundamental purpose of survival brought out the fundamental values of life. Witness that a woman was more respected in the rowdiest mining camps by the lowest dredge of male society than she is now in circles that pride themselves of this sophistication. They knew being a woman was a full-size job. They saw it demonstrated so successfully that they were quite ready to respect a woman simply because she was a woman. They make a splendid pageant. Those familiar figures that parade out of the past before us through the pages of books and across the motion picture screen. He's talking about now, he says, the trader, the trapper, the scout, and the 49er, and the desperado, the easy rider, the stage driver, the cavalryman, the cattle rustler, and the cowboy. Now that they have passed in actuality into oblivion, they will grow immortal in legend and will identify themselves forever with the winning of the West. So what he's talking about is, we look today, even today, we look about the winning of the West, we see all these characters that stand out, you know, the marshals and the frontiersmen and the cattle drivers and so forth. But here's what he continues to say. But they did not win the West. They opened it, and that is all. It was not within their power to civilize it, referring to the cattle rustlers and the desperados and the cattle drivers and so forth. It was not in their power to civilize it, to give it permanence and purpose, or a tangible hope and vision of its future, or to create in it the sinews of a nation. No, the West was won. Our whole continental territorial expanse was won by a far different figure, seldom dwelt in the glorious or glamorous chronicles of our history. You can hardly see her face, not because it's covered with cosmetics, but because it is concealed by a faded sunbonnet. And positively, my dear, she has no cheek at all, but a tired child resting its head on her knees. Flashes of the setting sun falling like prophetic arrows across her shawl, as if the great rough wagon in which she sits lumbers slowly onward. And a few simple household needs, essentials from the familiar home she has left, for use in the unknown home ahead. Unknown, though this much is known, that it will be home because she is there. That was the figure that won the West, and all what we probably call our country. Now he says something very important that we need to consider. And this was 70 years ago he wrote this. Consider how he'll look at it even today, much more than then. He said, if we do not have the good sense to be proud of the pioneer mother, we should have the good grace to be ashamed of ourselves. A great many things can happen in 90 years. Now he's going to talk about a gal called Christina Ostrom. Her name was, maiden name was Johnson, Christina Johnson. He writes of her, she came from Sweden, and he continues here. I believe I have this on the screen. The spring of 1852 found the Johnson family, that's Christina, as a young girl, and her family, on board a sailing vessel bound for America. The crossing of the Atlantic in those days was far from the convenient trip of today. The passengers carried their own food with them. The Johnson party's quarters were below the waterline, and their beds had to be placed crosswise of the course of the vessel to ensure the sleepers stayed in them. So rough was the voyage. After a voyage of 5 weeks, the family landed at Boston. Chicago was their next destination of the immigrant band. So they took passage for that city in a stock car. Not a particularly pleasant convenience or a very smooth ride in those days. St. Louis being a starting point for traffic on the upper Mississippi. The party proceeded. Part of the trip was made by riverboat, the predecessors of the railroad. Cholera was rampant in those days, attacked the immigrants on arrival in St. Louis, and deprived Christina Johnson of her mother and one sister. This promised land of America must have looked very dismal to the immigrant girl 14 years old, detained in the pest house on the banks of the Mississippi, while her mother lay dying in a hospital in the city apart from all members of the family. Christina, being the oldest child, it fell on her to act as a mother to her smaller brothers and sisters. The spring of 1853 saw the pioneer band on board a steamer bound for Galena, Illinois. Here the party rested while Mr. Johnson went on ahead to Lansing, Iowa, and made arrangements for securing 120 acres of land in Center Township for $1.25 an acre. May 3rd, the party landed in Lansing, that's in Iowa. Here a team of oxen were purchased for $60 and 2 cows for $40. Thus equipped, the party set out to their wilderness holdings 10 miles distance. A dugout or sod house was built for the family abode. The next order of work was the clearing of 3 or 4 acres. This was all planted in corn, with the exception of a small garden plot in which Christina cultivated corn, cabbage, and the like. Peter Johnson next enclosed his clearing with a rail fence. This took so much time that winter caught the family before a roof could be placed on the cabin. Then in the process of construction, wintering in the dugout brought more pioneer hardships. The space was small and crowded, and many winter morning the family awoke to shake off a mantle of snow from their blankets. The spring of 1854 saw a roof placed on the cabin. This was no small task, as all the shingles had to be handmade with only the aid of crude tools. Aside from taking care of her brothers and sisters, the youngest less than 2 years old, cooking the meals, spinning yarn, and making clothes for the family. During the harvest season, there was the grain to be cut with a cradle scythe and threshed by pounding on the frozen ground with a maul-like device. Pioneering was not without its pleasant diversions, however. Hunting was good. In the first winter, Peter Johnson killed 2 deer to vary the meat menu of salt pork. Prairie chickens were so thick that it was not unusual to kill 2 or 3 with one shot. Christina remembers one occasion when her father shot a deer, but only wounded the animal. He immediately threw himself upon the animal and called for Christina to help. This she did, and with the aid of a butcher knife, Mr. Deer was soon venison. Flood season left many fish stranded on the banks of the creek near the cabin, and it added further variation to their meals. A weekly diversion for our young pioneer was a walk to Lansing to purchase groceries, ammunition, and light necessities. First, of course, she had to get a permit from the government. I had to have that. She could not ride there as no horses. There were no horses, and the oxen were being used in the fields. When Christina Johnson was 18 years old, her father having married again, she became the bride of Magnus Ostrom. Mr. Ostrom worked on a farm adjoining the Johnson place. The young groom had worked hard and saved enough money to purchase 40 acres of land from his employer. Mr. Ostrom's wedding dress was real elaborate, requiring 12 yards of material, about an equal number of hoops. 11 children were born to the Ostroms. Magnus Ostrom died a few years ago. Now remember, this was written in 1940. Magnus Ostrom died a few years ago at the rare old age of 94. All right, so anyway, continuing on here now. In the end, pioneer women would leave more than discarded furniture along the trail as they traveled west. Many buried not only one child, but also several. A child could fall out of a wagon and quickly be run over before anyone could react. Husbands killed during accidents were also not that exceptional. Pioneer women themselves also perished. Typhoid, cholera, traveled quickly through many wagon trains, killing at random. Indian skirmishes did occur, but not as many as one might think. Most Indian skirmishes were the settlers who had reached their destination. Babies were born in the roughest conditions. Many died, and the women would not only have a heartbreak of the infant's death, but also of having to leave behind the body in a place that they knew they'll never see again. Once they did reach their destination, the work was far from over. A house would need to be built. And as many arrived in late summer or fall, that meant that this work often would be done in the cold of winter. Women quickly learned to wield an axe right alongside of her husband. At the first sign of spring, a garden would need to be planted. After trees were cleared and stumps removed, the ground would need to be worked up. This often entailed heavy work behind an ox or a mule. After the planting was done, water would have to be supplied. There was besides water for cooking, cleaning, washing, that they were already hauling every day. Pioneer women also had to deal with rodents, marauding animals, including bear and coyotes and lions. Indians were also a concern, and some did fall to the death of the Indians' hand. Women who headed west quickly learned that there was much more to life than teas and visiting. Through the journals that many left behind, we know that most would do it again. This was their life. Now, I'm going to read here about Miro's mom, her father, Miro's grandfather. The story I'm going to read here is not unlike the story probably most of you have in your own family. We all have stories. We may not remember them, may not even know what they are. But all of us have stories of the endurance that our forefathers went through. Muriel's mom spoke of the hardships that her mother had to undertake. Left as a widow with 9 children, she kept the family secure without any help from the government. Referring to the Brendamills, her folks, her mother and family. They became fiercely independent and fiercely strong. I might want to add that her aunt died in the same room she was born in, 70-some years later. That's of interest. They became fiercely independent and fiercely strong. Grandma Brendamill was a small woman and would have to use a stool to stand upon as she would hook the team of large workhorses for a trip into town. Her Aunt Rose, which died a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago, this was sent to us. Her Aunt Rose wrote this in a letter to Muriel a few years ago, and although it does not refer directly about her grandma Brendamill, it does show the responsibility that fell upon her shoulders when her husband died. Her grandma Rose, or her Aunt Rose, wrote this. I was thinking of my father of so many years ago. I remember how my father, often in the wintertime, would harness up the horses early in the spring. This would have been sometime probably about 1915. Remember how my father, often in the wintertime, would harness up the horses early in the morning. Often in the winter, whether 0 or below, and would leave the house around 5 a.m. Of course, in the winter it was dark. He would travel into town to get much needed groceries and supplies. Things like flour, coffee, sugar, and no doubt other things. He wouldn't be back until late at night, about 10 p.m. Now the distance from where they lived to town was 20 miles. He had a buffalo skin coat, but would have to get off this cutter or sleigh and run beside it to try to keep warm. He always had a small bag of candy for his kids. Then he had to unharness, then feed and water the horses before supper. And she writes, it is a shame that people today have so little understanding and appreciation for the endurance and strength of their forefathers. I know we hear, or somebody could probably tell us, the hardships that the migrants have to endure coming to America. And they might say, well, they have to endure all. There's a big difference. Our forefathers came here and scratched out of the earth and built an empire. These so-called migrants aren't builders. They are invaders, parasites, looking to live off the labor that your forefathers created. God gave us mothers who with courage crossed the Atlantic in tiny ships and faced the struggles of long ocean voyages. Mothers who would join in the struggle for independence. They would travel through the Cumberland Gap of the Appalachians, through the Midwest, cross the prairies, through the Rockies, into the fertile valleys of California and Oregon. God gave us hundreds and thousands of mothers who reached down to the soul to find the strength to build this nation. They found the courage to overcome the struggles and the hardships of moving across the wilderness of America, building homes, clearing fields, building churches, schools, and hospitals. In the midst of all this, they overcame the sadness of burying their loved ones along the pathway to the west. They walked along the prairies. They bore children in covered wagons. They trusted in God, bowed their head in prayer, and rose from prayer to protect their homes from savages seeking to scalp the men, rape the women, and carry off the children. They just didn't read about Manifest Destiny. They lived it. They faced the cruel hardships of winter in long, tiny log cabins, taught their children by a flickering flame of candlelight. They helped butcher the cattle, tend the fields, and defend their homes. They made their soap, churned their butter, plowed the fields, and washed the clothes in boiling pots of water, while teaching their children, nursing their babies, and cooking over an open fire. These are the ones that built America. They built it by their grit, their faith, courage, and their sheer strength of willpower. And now we are being told that we are to be ashamed of their racism. Politicians, preachers, every politician in Washington, or your state capitals, where every politician, for the most part, runs for office. Every preacher you see on TV tells us that we are to be ashamed of the racism of our forefathers. And yet there's not a single preacher you see on TV or a single politician you see on TV that is worthy to touch the callous hand, stand in the shadow, or be in the same room as the simplest farm woman who stood next to her husband in all the trials of pioneer life and built a republic. These mothers we talked about, we see on the screen. These mothers are worthy of honor, accolades, and monuments. We're told in Exodus 20:12, honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the earth. We have long ago stepped aside from honoring our fathers and our mothers. Every politician, every preacher wants you to dishonor them. Every politician, every preacher wants you to call them racist and Christian extremists. Our forefathers and our foremothers built and suffered a lot to build a country. And we want to give it away to that. We want to give it away. All the struggles and the heartaches, and not to be redundant, but blood, sweat, and tears they endured, half of which we cannot even imagine, even by reading a few paragraphs. All that they've done, our forefathers, now that we are to be ashamed of them, walk away from their memory, dishonor their memory, and give away our country to that. Truly, we're to honor our fathers and our mothers. We were told to do that, not just mom and dad at home, but our fathers and our mothers who built the nation. Because if we don't do that, then we will not be long upon this land. Let's close the word of prayer. Our Father, we are grateful for every ounce of blood, every tear shed, every muscle and back strain under heavy labor by those who have gone on before us, who built this nation and built this for us, our children. We've inherited it. This inheritance, a great inheritance we have received. We indeed help us to properly honor our fathers and our mothers, that our days may be long upon this land.
For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delights of His love until all on the altar we lay. For the favor He shows and the joy He bestows, and for them who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at His feet, or will walk by His side in the way. What He says we will do, where He sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and